As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Then moving ahead to verse 18, while he was saying this, a synagogue leader came and knelt before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her and she will live." Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. Just then a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She said to herself, "If I could only touch his cloak, I will be healed." Jesus turned and saw her. "Take heart, daughter," he said, "your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed at that moment. When Jesus entered the synagogue's leader's house and saw the noisy crowd and the people playing pipes, he said, "Go away, the girl is not dead but asleep." But they laughed at him. After the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took the girl by the hand, and she got up. News of this spread through all that region. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So as I read through this passage and prepared, I was wondering why the people that developed the Revised Common Lectionary include two very different stories in 1 week's reading. The calling of Matthew could be one complete sermon, and one could break up the woman with the bleeding issue and the raising of the little girl into two sermons. But as I looked it over and studied these passages, I found a common link: sinners. So now that I have your attention, let's talk about sin and sinners. In an old episode of The Simpsons, Homer is complaining about the cost of things. He says, "Look at this Bible I bought, $15, and talk about a preachy book. Everyone's a sinner, except this guy." Sin is one of the most used words in the Bible. Yet sin means different things to different people. You call someone a sinner, and they may get quite upset, as if you're judging them. People tend to label others who do things that we don't like as sinners, as if we're defining sin from our own perspective rather than God's. And too often the church gets caught up pointing out the sins of those out there rather than ourselves. Or as that guy once said, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own?" Perhaps sin is in the eye of the beholder. But now, in Judaism of Jesus' day, the term sinner had a slightly different meaning. It usually meant members of despised trades that they were considered ritually unclean. Camel drivers, sailors, shepherds, butchers, physicians, and others like that. Most of these people came in contact with unclean animals or bodily fluids, especially blood, and that made them unclean. They would need to follow the law of Moses and do the appropriate sacrifice to be ritually purified before they could attend worship or enter into society. But due to their occupations, they couldn't do that. If you're a doctor coming in contact with this every day, you cannot follow the ritual purification processes and be brought into the community. Now, tax collectors are placed in the category of sinners. We all know that, don't we? They would overcharge people. They had a certain amount they had to pay to Rome, and then they could collect whatever they wanted and keep the difference. So they were conspiring with Rome, and they were overcharging people. They took advantage of the poor, and they consorted with the enemy. And those who followed the law regularly were not considered sinners, for they were ritually clean. And if they did something against the law, they would go to the temple, make their sacrifice, and everything was good. They'd continue on. So in our passage, Jesus calls Matthew a tax collector. And then he has the audacity to go to Matthew's home and dine with other tax collectors and sinners. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus responds. He quotes Hosea the prophet, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." And Jesus lives this out. As you see who Jesus not only approaches, but who he calls as his followers: tax collectors, fishermen, women of questionable reputation. Jesus came for those in need of a spiritual healer, not the righteous. And it's pretty clever what Jesus is saying here, because he goes, "I have come for those in need, not for the righteous." But what do you think? I think he's really saying is, you may think you are righteous because you follow the law. However, you completely miss the law precisely because you have no mercy. He redefines the concept of sin and righteousness away from the law and directly to our hearts. Sin can be anything we do or think that takes us away from God, including our own self-righteousness. The Apostle Paul in Romans 3:23 says, "All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." We are all then sinners, for we have all strayed in one way or another from God's glory. And then the passage jumps over a few verses and takes us to a story of a little girl who is in need of a miracle. Her father asks Jesus to come and lay his hands on her. And as Jesus heads to the man's home, another person enters the story, a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. As a side note, I recommend you read this story in Luke's Gospel in chapter 8. Luke gives us far more details about this. What we do know is that this woman, because of the blood, is unclean. According to the law, she must be isolated. However, her situation has been occurring for 12 years. 12 years of loneliness, 12 years of isolation, 12 years of suffering. And she would be called a sinner, just like Matthew the tax collector. Luke's gospel tells us she spent everything she had on doctors to no avail. She needs a different kind of physician, and when he came through town, she went to see him, because this woman needs mercy, not sacrifice. And after Jesus heals the woman, he continues to the home where the 12-year-old lies dead. Now, why would this young girl be sick and die? Some might say, from a very flawed theological place, that the father must be a sinner, that he did something in his life to cause the loss of his daughter. Some would say it's divine punishment. Now, we know this is completely wrong, but I'm sure many of you have met someone who has said something like that to you or somebody else about an illness, about a sickness, about a bad thing. Let me say this. There are obviously certain lifestyles, whether they are sinful or not, that can lead to illness. Many athletes, after retiring, have difficult lives due to multiple injuries. People who work in jobs dealing with toxic substances may develop diseases over the course of many years. That's not about their personal sin. People get sick. People have conditions. And it's not God punishing them or their parents. We live in a fallen world that has disease and sickness in it. And I have good news for you. There is a divine physician. In the Old Testament, one of God's titles is Yahweh Rapha, the Lord who heals. And he is embodied in Jesus Christ as the one who can heal physical ills, mental ills, emotional ills, and spiritual ills. And that last one is the ultimate healing. Jesus will heal and cleanse any sinner who asks. Jesus is merciful, and this very same Jesus calls his followers to offer the same mercy. This community of faith we call church is a hospital for sinners. It is a place where people can come and hear of the good news of Jesus. It is a place where a person can find healing and wholeness, forgiveness, acceptance, and redemption, precisely because Jesus offers the same. So many people in our world, in our communities, are just looking for some place to belong. They feel isolated, and it doesn't matter why. They just feel isolated. They need to know there is a place where they can be loved and healed. This is the call of the church, to spread that love and healing of Jesus. For he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Amen.